Okay, everybody. Good morning, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. I am Katherine Eban. I'm an investigative journalist and a contributing editor with Vanity Fair magazine. It is an honor to be moderating this terrific panel today, brought to you by the Center for Investigative Journalism on building databases for transparency. So I think the plan here is over the next hour and a half, we're going to have a brief 1-minute introduction of each of the panelists, and then we'll have a discussion of a variety of questions, and at about the 1 hour and 15-minute mark, we will go to a Q&A. So if you do have questions, please enter them into the Q&A portion of this Zoom link, and we will get to those questions hopefully. So now I would like to invite the panelists to offer a brief 1-minute introduction, starting with Rebecca Lee. Rebecca, where is Rebecca Lee? She is not there. Let us move on first to Lieke Ploeger. Lieke?
Yeah, thank you, Katherine. So yeah, my name is Lieke Ploeger, and I work at the Disruption Network Lab. So we are a non-profit organization that's based in Berlin, Germany. And we work on the intersection of politics, technology, and society with the overarching goal to expose systems of power and injustice. And to do that, we organize international conferences. And we also run a community program of related meetups and workshops, which is what I'm leading. And we currently, our program that's running is called Tactics of Empowerment, and we're cooperating on that together also with Transparency International. So for our events, we have really an interdisciplinary focus. So we really want to bring in dialogue experts that work across different fields and that can work on revealing such power imbalances. And of course, this also often involves the use of data. Recent topics we discussed are, for example, around AI and discrimination, the Panama Papers leaks and the tax evasion topic, and also speculation on the housing market. And then with the community program specifically, the one I work on, we organize more hands-on meetups and workshops connected to these conferences, where we bring in people to share skills and tools to fight digital injustice. So yeah, thinking of the topic for today, I also come from a background of working in open data, previously worked at Open Knowledge International. And we also often try to involve people that work with data and databases in our events. And usually this is with a focus on the end user and on activists working with data, and to sort of build a bridge between researchers and end users. So we try to connect these different areas of expertise. And yeah, for opening up such systems and exposing injustice, data is really vital in our work. So I'm excited to join the panel today.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. Delphine Reuter, let us hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. So my name is Delphine Reuter. I am a Belgian journalist. I work for the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, or ICIJ in short. It's a long name. I'm based in Brussels, but ICIJ is based in Washington, D.C. We have staff around the world, and I'm part of the data and research team. We have a tech team, a product team, a reporting team, and a fundraising team. And we try to work horizontally. So I work with the reporters, with the tech team, to find what kind of data and research help we can provide. So it depends on the kind of project we work on. We also work with the media partners because our model is collaborative. So we have from a few dozens to 100 media partners for the different projects we work on. So yeah, delighted to be here and talk about data with everybody else.
Thank you. And Jack Poulson.
Hi, my name is Jack. I'm the executive director of a nonprofit named Tech Inquiry, which formed after I spent a few years at Google as a research scientist working on recommendation systems and natural language processing, and ended up resigning over some human rights issues there that pulled me into the, let's say, public-private interface between tech companies and the US government. And that ended up leading to our organization starting to submit a lot of Freedom of Information Act requests, monitoring US federal contracts between tech companies and the US government, and then doing a lot of monitoring as well of political contributions, lobbying filings, and starting to combine a lot of this for the purpose of helping to inform some tech worker organizing. So very happy to be here.
Wonderful. We've got Rebecca Lee back, so let's just circle back to her. Rebecca, a 1-minute introduction, please.
I'm very sorry for that. So I'm the Chief Impact Officer at Open Corporates, and Open Corporates is the largest open database of companies in the world. And our mission is to make company data open for all, to map every legal entity provenanced directly from official public data in order to promote global corporate transparency. To do that, we collect, standardize, and make company data available for free via the website. And we work to make company data open across the world to allow everyone to find out who they're in business with. My own personal background is professional services. I led PwC's investigative analytics group within forensic services in the UK, from small investigations up to the big, large regulatory investigations, so sanctions, KYC, banking misconduct, as well as proactive data-led compliance and risk management, all around identifying, detecting and preventing financial and other crime. And my current role is to work with journalists and other public benefit organisations to use Open Corporates to uncover financial crime and also to use the data for the public good.
Wonderful, thank you. Jeremy Merrill. Jeremy.
Hey everybody, nice to be here. My name is Jeremy Merrill. I'm an investigative journalist who works frequently with data and databases based in Atlanta, Georgia in the United States. I'm currently freelance, but previously I've worked at Quartz, ProPublica, and the New York Times. Recently, I've been spending a lot of my time building big databases of ads on Facebook and YouTube through crowdsourcing to find micro-targeting tactics by American politicians and to expose scams that are perpetrated by paying these tech companies lots of money. I also worked with ICIJ on the Luanda leaks and Mauritius leaks projects, experimenting with using artificial intelligence to help search through these giant piles of unstructured documents.
Wonderful, thank you. Nisha Boyle.
Hi everyone, it's great to see you here and speak with you today. My name is Naoise and I'm a researcher at the Centre for Research Architecture at Goldsmiths, University of London. I'm currently researching modes of governance that have been implemented against ethnic minorities in Xinjiang, China. And in addition to the investigative research, I'm also developing a project called the Xinjiang Governance Database, which documents and tracks projects involving biometric surveillance, carceral infrastructure, and amongst kind of other layers of governmentality. So the project really attempts to record a genealogy of governance techniques through a range of investigative methodologies and gives researchers, journalists, and activists access to a platform to both source and also contribute data. My background is in user experience research and software design, and I have collaborated with projects that use open source research in a human rights context.
Wonderful, thank you. Jacinta Gonzalez.
Hi everyone, my name is Jacinta Gonzalez. I'm a senior campaign organizer in Phoenix, Arizona with an organization called Mi Gente. Mi Gente is a national membership organization of Latino, Latina, Latine, Chicane folks in the United States that are organizing for climate, economic, racial, and gender justice. Personally, a lot of my work has been around immigration, criminalization, policing issues. So I was very involved in the Not One More Deportation campaign, which then led us to start to do corporate research into who are the tech and data companies partnering with Immigration and Customs Enforcement and the Department of Homeland Security in the United States to help surveil, detain, and deport immigrants. So we've been doing a lot of research here around a variety of different companies, including data brokers, data analysts, cloud service providers that are kind of building up this deportation machinery for ICE. Obviously, this was a huge issue under the Trump administration, and now entering into a different political moment, we're trying to figure out how to organize to continue to fight against these practices. So very excited to be here and be part of this conversation.
And I will make my first apology of this session, Jacinta. I think I blew the pronunciation of your first name. Apologies. Friedrich Lindenberg. Friedrich.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm with the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, OCCRP, complicated acronym crowd. And it's a global network of investigative reporters. We do pretty much what it says in the name. We look to unravel grand corruption cases and report on kleptocracies, traditionally mainly in Central Eastern Europe, but also now in a few countries in Africa, Latin America, and around the world. Inside of OCCRP, I run a small data team which is building Aleph. And Aleph is basically a data platform for research in anti-corruption. What we're trying to do is we're trying to build one layer, which is an archive of journalistic source material. It at the moment combines about 120 or so leaked data sets and a lot of other data that we've been able to collect. We also run a fleet of about 250 crawlers that update public databases, government databases the entire time. And that's kind of the archive that we're trying to build for people. On top of that, we're trying to build tools that help journalists to process, cross-reference, share, and organize their evolving knowledge while they're investigating their stories and kind of build a collaborative understanding.
Thank you. That's wonderful. And Georg Newman.
Thank you, Katherine. I work for the Open Contracting Partnership, and we're an international nonprofit that works to basically ensure that information on the full procurement process is transparent. Data from planning to tender, award, contract, and to the delivery really should be available as openly and as open data. And as you know, procurement has been in the spotlight this year. Sort of a $13 trillion market, and the reality is that sort of like this current approach that is paper-based, slow, and more often not completely opaque does not work. And on top of that, every country has its own procurement system, and the same for municipalities and cities in many countries. So that's really where we come in, because we've developed an open contracting data standard, which is a free global best practice guide. It guides governments on how to publish timely, high quality open data and which information is the most useful. And it's currently being implemented by 30 countries, cities, and other organizations, and another 20 to 30 are already working on it. We also realize that data is only useful when it's used. So we have tools to help monitor procurement and ensure that that data can be analyzed and reused, and we'll talk about these later in the conversation.
Thank you so much. And last but not least, Steve Day.
Thank you, Katherine. And thanks for having me here. It's really great to be here. Yeah, so my name's Steve. I'm the technical lead at Open Ownership. Open Ownership are an NGO, civil society organization, who are dedicated to the topic of beneficial ownership transparency. We were formed by a coalition of kind of anti-corruption and transparency organizations, including Open Corporates. We have Rebecca here from today. And we basically help countries implement registers of beneficial ownership. So that's people who own and control companies in their jurisdictions, basically. So we do that from all the way from kind of legal support with definitions through to policies, and then technical help in actually building those registers. One key aspect, one key kind of product that we build as part of that is called the Global Beneficial Ownership Register. So we try to pull together all of the national data sources, and very similar to Open Corporates, kind of standardize and connect them and make it possible to follow ownership across jurisdictions rather than just be stuck within one country's thing. So the register is a web-based application that's free for everybody to access, and we also kind of give free access to download all of that data for other uses. In terms of background, previously I worked for a civic tech organization called My Society, who built a couple of very popular databases such as MapIt, which is a database of administrative boundaries, and Every Politician, which is a kind of database, as the name suggests, of every elected official worldwide.
Amazingly useful, say I, having just recovered from the US election. So as you can see, we have an all-star panel here of database experts. So what we're going to do is we're going to turn now to a series of questions that the panelists here are going to discuss for roughly 9 minutes each. And then please, just a reminder, put your questions in the Q&A function. and we will turn to those in about an hour. So question number one, what are the priorities for those using databases for their investigative research? And how far can these be accommodated by those who build and maintain them? And I think the participants on this question are going to be Friedrich, Naoise, Jacinta, Delphine, and Rebecca. But of course, if other panelists want to weigh in, they can. Who would like to begin? Just panelists, you can jump in.
I can go first. I think obviously, I hope the outcome of this panel will be that it varies really a lot. But I think for the people in OCCRP, they are quite literal about following the money. So for them, they basically have 1 or 3 goals when they use these types of databases. They want to background a person or a company, find out everything there is to know about them. They might also have like a whole set of people or companies that they're interested in already and kind of want to see where else do they pop up. Are they mentioned in the Panama Papers or do they own real estate somewhere? Thirdly, they might want to deal with a leaked data set that they've been given. That's also something that we deal with a lot, is that someone receives, whether it's a thumb drive or an entire hard drive or an entire computer full of stuff, and they then need to figure out, is there journalism to be found in here? Yeah, in order to do that, I think what we're trying to do is both build our technology that provides easy data access, but also then kind of collect the right kind of starting material in there. And that's basically everything that helps follow the money, whether it's land and company ownership, political power, government finance and procurement data, illicit banking, and most of all, if we can get an insight into the offshore economy, right? So what data we acquire, though, is mostly driven by what investigations are already kind of starting, often driven by where we have a source or a person that gives us like an initial set of information.
Another panelist would like to jump in here?
Sure, I can go next. Well, I guess, like, first of all, I think this is very dependent on the role and context of the people that are actually engaging in any kind of investigative research. However, I would say that there's also some general patterns and themes from people using databases for their investigative work. So I thought I'd just kind of like situate this in some kind of research that I've done recently. And that was kind of like discovery research for a project where I spoke to several groups of people that are working in an investigative capacity around their current research challenges, workflows, and objectives. And again, these are people that are mostly kind of like academic researchers, investigative journalists, and human rights activists. And some of the priorities of using databases that were identified mostly really focused around 3 things. First of all, data validation and reliability. Secondly, gathering data that speaks from a range of perspectives and vantage points, let's say. And finally, finding new relationships in the data, which leads to new narratives and insights. So again, like I would say, the current challenges that were often kind of shared amongst the people that I spoke to were the number one, there was often a lack of access to the physical geographies because, again, of the nature of researching often highly politicized and contested spaces. So I think this is where the ability to research, and as they say, kind of like see from a distance, comes in, and online data can offer a way to either start to build a picture or rather to help corroborate sometimes limited sources on the ground. And linked to that aspect, there is also the direct obfuscation from governments and other actors of information that is coming out of these spaces, making it very difficult for individual researchers to source and find different types of information. So I think there's something also interesting here, an interesting aspect of access or around access. And lastly, something I think which I found really interesting is the shift from, let's say, like more of a hypothesis-driven investigative model to more of a data-centric and generative model of knowledge generation, in which researchers are really kind of looking for emergent properties from large data sources. So this idea of putting data in conversation with a wide range of sources and media, and then kind of like examining emergent relations is something that seems to be kind of becoming a priority for investigative researchers that are using more of a data-centric approach. So maybe like with that said, I think there's a range of ways that database projects can start to support these challenges and priorities. Firstly, just quite kind of basically. There's a huge amount of work that goes into sourcing and validating data to check its credibility. And so as much kind of like background work to provide data that has been reviewed and somewhat verified can be hugely beneficial for smaller organizations and individuals that are lacking in resources. And then secondly, the ability to gather data from a wide range of sources and even kind of like sensors or technologies to gather, again, this idea of multiple perspectives on the problem. So I think that's a really interesting challenge for teams working on database projects at the moment, is to really kind of curate evidence and information that can come into conversation with each other in new and interesting ways.
Let's hear from a few other panelists. Jacinta, would you like to jump in here?
Sure. You know, I think my perspective on this question is probably very different from folks who are actually doing the research, right? To me, it actually, like, for us as organizers, we partner with researchers to precisely be able to figure out what is the information that we can use in our campaigns. And so from that perspective, I would say that, like, our priorities are maybe slightly different as we're trying to think through how we're using data and information to both change culture, but also change policy and also change regulations, right? So for us, it's not only I mean, some of the things that have been mentioned around making sure that information is true and making sure that we have a source for it, and all of those things are incredibly important, because when you're in David and Goliath type of fights, right, they're going to use anything you can against you. And so making sure that your data sources are verified is incredibly important. But I think part of what we're looking for in terms of data sets is ways to really sort of expose corporations, but then also tell a very concrete story. And so for us, the way that information is both exposed, put out there, the story that it's telling and how it's accessible to people can be really important. And so I would just kind of wanted to show how in some examples, for example, we'll use the same source of information, but sometimes we'll put it out as a report, sometimes we'll put it out as a graphic, and sometimes we'll put it out as a comic book, right? It's staying the same information, but just kind of in different formats, depending on who we're trying to make it accessible to. Because for us, it's really important that in a lot of these conversations around, for example, corporate accountability, the way that corporate information is put out in data sets makes it sometimes even more inaccessible to people, which makes it even harder to have the conversation or have the fight. And so for us, so much of the work is actually translating the information from data sources that we can use to data sources that we can use in the media to data sources that grassroots people that are actually being impacted by these systems will know what to do with this information. And I think that one of the ways to doing that well is actually collaborating with people who are impacted by these systems and who also have this information. Because I know, for example, that if we had partnered with a corporate group that didn't want to talk to organizers around how deportations actually happened, that would have impacted the way we did the corporate analysis of all of the contracts that the Department of Homeland Security had. So it's because that we actually had the grassroots knowledge to figure out where to kind of target the research that we were able to get the data and the information that kind of was the most helpful. And from there, we can kind of go in these different ways of trying to translate it. So I think for us, just the priorities are really different depending on how we're going to use the information and what part of the campaign it's contributing to.
Thank you. And Delphine or Rebecca, would you like to jump in here to join this interesting discussion?
Yeah, I'm happy to go next. So I think for me, the priorities differ dependent on the scale of the investigation. So we have over 5 million unique users to our website per month, and those people are generally following the links manually. So for them, our database is about the website and its ability to walk through it and identify and draw those links for you. But when you're looking at kind of global multinational companies and individuals or a large scale investigation, then being able to look at that data through a structured form is important. So you want to be able to reconcile lists of companies with open corporates and then automate the retrieval and analysis of that data. And as such, we provide all that data and the access via the API and bulk data for free to public benefits too, from an open refine API and providing access. And a really good example of that is the recent kind of anti-corruption data collective investigation where they looked at 600,000 companies from the US SBA payment protection program and run them through open corporates. And you're just not going to be able to do that on a one-to-one basis where you're looking at things individually. But on both sides, it's really important to see this information in a standardized way and globally. So we don't just deal with companies within our, or investigate companies within our own local state or country. In our personal lives, let alone in business, we interact constantly with global companies. And so we need to gain access and to see that data cross jurisdictions globally, and to delve into it, we need some consistency. And that's what kind of databases like open ownership and open corporates are trying to provide, is getting all of that access of data together in one place so that it's available, it's searchable, and you can do it at scale.
Thank you so much. Delphine, let's hear from you before we move on to the second question on our panel today.
Sure. It's a bit the same as what Friedrich was saying, because we kind of have the same types of organizations. So we have a collaborative model. And although we do have reporters in-house who access the documents, we also want to make sure that the users, the media partners that we work with, have the capacity to tell us what they're searching for, what they're looking for, and we can accommodate those needs as best we can. So we have a range of users that we that we have to contend with. We cannot always make everybody happy, but as what Friedrich was saying, the things that they're usually looking for are beneficial ownerships, who owns what company, when, where they are based, when they had those companies, if it was at the same time as, I don't know, if they were president at the same time, or if they had some reason to hide those companies. So we try to provide searchable data sets that are as easy to use as possible, but also offer as many functionalities as possible, which is not an easy balance to strike, because the more things you want to do with the data, the more complicated it can become. But yeah, otherwise it was pretty close to what Friedrich was saying.
Thank you so much. We're going to move on to the second question now. Question for panelists. Where data is sourced through public registries, how can we avoid low levels of data quality? What level of engagement with authorities risks the independence of the database? What level of engagement with journalists risks loss of access to data and the impartiality of the database? Why don't we start here? Jeremy, would you like to begin this, kick off this discussion?
Sure. Thanks, Katherine. From my perspective as a journalist who works with data all the time, the data is only ever going to be the first step, where it's useful for developing a tip or a hunch, and for finding patterns. But then those always have to get confirmed through regular old shoe leather, calling people on the phone kinds of journalism. I remember one story I did when I was just starting out in my career, where there was a database of fundraisers that politicians had gone to. And so I joined that up with all the votes in the legislature that they had missed. Say, oh, this person was playing hooky. They weren't. They were absent from their job to go raise money, based on this database of parties. And then when I started doing the actual, I put in a whole bunch of work before I actually verified what was going on, which was a mistake, because it turns out the database wasn't right. That just because there was a party that the politician was supposedly at doesn't mean they were actually there. And a lot of times the reasons that they missed the vote was something totally separate, like they were sick or their kid was sick. And so we always have to check our work, but that doesn't mean the data, but we wouldn't even be able to get there if we didn't have the data.
Thank you. Jack, do you want to weigh in on these questions?
Yeah, I would add on to what Jeremy said, though from the perspective of massive amounts of curation, not necessarily being drudgery, but finding numerous ways to like validate or add additional kind of citations for a conclusion you might want to draw from a set of databases is really important. One of the major things I spend a lot of time doing, and Open Corporates is enormously helpful for it, is looking through federal contracting, lobbying records, et cetera, just to find all the different names that a particular company might have appeared under, and then normalizing that to some canonical legal name, in a particular jurisdiction. And doing that is often extremely time consuming because it might be 100 different names. The company might have been acquired, divested, spun off. The name might just be very outdated, et cetera. And so I would say really having kind of a ready list of go-to places to go to validate, whether that's Open Corporates, Open Secrets, Little Sis, et cetera. All of these court listener, kind of cross-compiling all of these different sources is a way to give you more confidence in whatever sort of curation you're going to do of a database is really important.
Thank you. Steve, would you like to jump in here?
Sure. So, I mean, I might be slightly biased in the sense that we help people build these public registries in the first place. But I think it's important to acknowledge that, like, or just to encourage everyone to engage with the public registry. I mean, I think if you find low quality data in a public registry, that means that some public funds have been used to produce that poor quality data, and it helps to kind of point that out and to flag that up to people. And it's a long haul to get that fixed. But we have seen results, for example, in the UK recently with the reform of Companies House. It's probably not what anybody would have dreamt, or would have ideally wanted. But there are improvements being made to public data because people have complained about it in the short run, basically. So yeah, I think some of the other sources that we work with definitely would be characterized as low quality. I don't want to name names, but yeah, there are some public beneficial ownership registries out there with very poor data in them. But I would echo the points that other people made, that often there's other public information available which you can cross-reference that with to improve that quality. So again, yeah, Open Corporates and other company registers, for example, in the context of beneficial ownership data, are often really helpful to get more up-to-date information about companies, to check that the data is looking correct and that kind of thing.
Thank you. Rebecca, would you like to weigh in here?
Yeah, absolutely. So all of our data comes from official data sources, and agree with everyone. There are lots of data quality issues. I think my first point is that having this data in Open Corporates in a publicly accessible way, echoing Steve, has been really beneficial. It's brought a many eyes effect. It's brought on a powerful data quality loop where the millions of users that visit us each month, as alongside all the investigative journalists, etc., help identify issues that need to be corrected in the respective registry's data. I'm not necessarily concerned by an impartiality issue for us. I think more concerning is we can risk the access to the data, such as barriers being put up to stop automated collection or restrictive terms and conditions. And where we do try and engage, they're not very active, mostly in engaging with us in terms of large-scale data quality issues. There's one particular where there's a huge problem even with the open data set, and we've been trying to constantly engage with them, but we haven't had any luck yet. On the other hand, UK's Company House is a great user group and a great forum, which we're part of as well as some of the other people on the panel. And by releasing their data as bulk data, this allows the analysis of data quality at scale. And this goes back to my point earlier. It's looking at data at scale is incredibly important because you get examples of such as Global Witnesses, the companies we keep, which looked at the beneficial register and company ownership and really identified systematic issues, which then strengthen the case for Companies House to take forward the reforms that they wanted to do. So I suppose it's about assessing registry by registry how confident you are that engaging is going to have the right outcome, and where we have really active registries like we have in the UK, then you can see real benefits and steps forward from that engagement with the NGO journalistic community and companies like ours.
Thank you. Georg, can we hear from you on this?
Yes, thanks. Yeah, I think often the issue with public registry is that, and data quality issues, that data quality issues are often by design. So one of the reasons, for example, that you don't find information in e-procurement systems that you're looking for is that they have been designed for something else. They have been designed for transactions between government and business. So if we analyze procurement data that is available globally, you'll find that most of the data you'll find on the tender process, about the moment where the government will want something from the business. They're not designed for public accountability, right? So you will not find information on like when are things being paid, when can you find additional information on the beneficial owner, etc. Right? So we try to change that, obviously, and we're similar like open ownership. We work with governments in trying to improve their system. So we have the data standard has about 200 to 300 data fields. Most of the time, maybe half of them are published. And there are a lot of manual errors. Currency mistakes can easily add 3 zeros to the value of a contract. But we do provide governments with, and to ensure better quality, I think there's a lot of things that we can do, right? We can provide governments with public assessments on quality and completeness of their data. We also see that working actually with government agencies to show what information is relevant and what they can actually do themselves can increase and help them engage with us, so sort of like add additional fields and improve the quality of the data. We also, and I think that's for us crucial, is really supporting civil society and journalists to analyze the data and keep up the pressure. The other thing is there are good systems that are not being used well. The UK's Contracts Finder is a decent system, but it's not being used and it's not updated in a timely manner. And apparently there are VIP channels for processing contracts. Colombia is an interesting case because it actually has a lot of data, and it also able to sort of like connect different databases, which is often the case as well. Data separated out to different databases, and you need open structured data to bring it together. However, we make sure, and you need to continuously make sure that you engage with the government, that changes in the data, often like in a year, there's 2 to 3 changes in the API, that those maintain the progress that has been made in the past. So that's something that I think is, again, very critical, that when we celebrate or when we see data, make sure it's there continuously. In Paraguay, the procurement agency has actually trained journalists to sort of like use the data so that they don't have to respond individually. So that's really a moment where where engagement actually increases the information and increases the quality of information. And then in some cases, it's not only the sort of like the public register, the information that is built on top of the public registry can add another level to it. So in Ukraine, civil society has sort of like linked a database with feedback on the processes, which is something that the government doesn't provide, but then you can find there. It's kind of a Tinder for tender that uses AI, artificial intelligence, to track red flags, and it's something that the government never could do. But once you have that open data, you can really sort of like get innovative about this. And there it's sort of like a win-win situation. So yeah, I think it's by design. So understanding that can really help improve the quality.
Thank you. So let's turn to our next topic area. Where data has been leaked, what are the steps required to verify information while maintaining source protection? Is there a need to strike a balance between methodological transparency and confidentiality? And Friedrich, why don't we start with you on this question?
Sure. I think with leaked data, I wish there was some really cool kind of cyberpunk answer to this, where we use like DKIM domain keys and error level analysis to do it all. But I think most of the time in practice, it comes down to very little digital and very, very much human stuff happening. And I think there's 2 key connections. One is with the source that we have. What we see a lot is people trying to spoon feed us data. We have like sources that literally write us memos that are like drafts of stories they'd like us to publish. And then there's like 3 emails that go along with it. And that's where we kind of have to go back and say, no, we write the story. You provide us like whatever evidence you have, and then we'll come to the conclusions, and getting the whole trove and avoid kind of getting this kind of drip effect. And the other side that kind of parallels this is also talking to the accused, right? Like, I think any reporting, obviously, that doesn't end up making a fair attempt at kind of getting the accused in your story, the target of your investigation, to have a say and to respond to accusations, that's also probably bad journalism, right? And so between these two kind of mechanisms, I think a lot of stuff lies. And then obviously there's a lot of techniques around parallel construction and just kind of also training in how to assess the plausibility of a document. And then there's like one final step that I also wanted to bring up, which is like when you have leaked data, there's often this problem of how much do you want to share it with the public. And we were supposed to have on this panel a speaker, Micah, who's made this amazing tool called Danger Zone that I want to recommend to people in this session, which basically you put a document in it, whether it's a PDF file or a Word document, and it'll attempt to generate a version of it that is has all the metadata removed, all the stuff that is sneakily likely to give up your source if you're not careful. And so if anyone here intends to publish stories that contain source documents, I'd really recommend you look at Danger Zone from The Intercept.
That's fantastic to know. What a great tool. Delphine, would you like to jump in here?
Sure. A lot of what we do is very similar to a CCRP. So we try to have a relationship with our source that is as trustworthy as possible. So we try to assess what the agenda of the source is as much as possible, but we trust implicitly once the process is done of source verification and analysis of the leak is done. We trust the process in the sense that we will not be discussing the source internally. We take source protection very, very, very seriously. So the process also happens after, once we have made this leak available to the media partners who can access it through the tool that we provide to them to go through the leak and analyze those documents. We trust the process in the sense that we believe that the collaborative model is about this giant brain. Each of us has a different brain, has a different perspective and different ways of analyzing the information, and they also come from different countries. So each of them can bring their own knowledge and approach to the data that we'll be looking at. So this makes it amazing because there will always be someone who knows if there is something that is wrong in the data, because they will say, look, there is something fishy here. This data is definitely not to be trusted. This has never happened, touch wood. But yeah, so it's, as Friedrich has said, there is really something that comes first with checking that the data is trustworthy. Like, for example, we ran part of the Panama Papers against data that was readily available from the Panama registry. But then you have to trust that the leak, the rest of the leak is trustworthy. You cannot check the veracity of all the documents. And then you have to trust the process and know that the journalists themselves will take their responsibility as well and will share the information if they come across anything that they think is suspicious.
That is very interesting. Jeremy, would you like to?
I would echo what Delphine said, that we can often verify in really cool ways, maybe like what Friedrich mentioned of verifying emails with DKIM, with domain key cryptographic signatures. Might be able to verify that some of the leak is definitely legitimate, definitely real. But for the other parts, there's really no substitute for taking the things in the leak as probable but not fully confirmed, finding the things we want to write about, and then going and verifying those the old-fashioned way by talking to additional sources or talking to the subjects of our story. And I also wanted to echo what Friedrich said about sort of parallel construction of, if there's a document that were leaked but we can't really talk about, figuring out the ways to get it individually from other sources who are less sensitive, or through Freedom of Information Act style requests.
Thank you. And Jacinta, I would love to hear from you on this question.
Sure. again, think that because of the type of work that we do, have a very, or not very, but like a slightly different approach to this. I think in moments where we've been approached by, for example, students or tech workers or government employees around, for example, information around how certain programs are working or what contracts exist and things like that. I think there's a lot of the verified information that people have described here. But I think part of the added component when you're doing the organizing is also thinking through the organizing strategy around potential retaliation. So it isn't uncommon that for us, when people are coming to us and saying, hey, I want to leak this about X, Y, or Z company, but I'm never going to find a job again. A lot of our work is actually, how do we figure out getting this person other job opportunities so that we can actually have that conversation, right? Or figuring out other ways of actually providing other documents to verify whatever someone's story is so that reporters are able to have the conversation. So I think, again, from the organizing perspective, there's just sort of like different elements in terms of how we're thinking through the full range of it. Because for us, it's not about just the information, but it's actually where the information is being used and what the impact is going to be having on the corporations that we're trying to target.
Thank you. Let's move on to our next question. How can we strike the best balance between providing detailed functionality and keeping a database user-friendly for non-technical users? Why don't we begin with Lieke here?
All right. Well, obviously there's some obvious tech features I think that could make things easier, like providing good search options and filtering and stuff like that. But speaking also from the experience of what we work on with the Disruption Lab, we try also to work on creating opportunities for people that build these databases to also interact with and get to know the possible end users. And by providing these ways that they can be in contact with each other and possibly also use the data sets already early on, they can be involved in the process. And this also lowers the barriers for them to be using the data. So they would also be willing to go through some more tech difficulty because they see the purpose behind it. So just one example that we worked on recently is that we had a conference called Evicted by Greed on speculation in the housing market. And we worked there with the researcher Christoph Trautvetter that did a lot of research on housing ownership structures in Berlin, built quite a big database. But there were a lot of housing activist groups in the city that were also doing independent research or smaller research, and they were not really in touch with each other. So by creating this moment of interaction and making them get to know each other, they could also be working together in the future and use this data. And this lowered the barrier for them to make the best out of this. Then we also often organize meetups with groups that have such data sets where they can explain how these work, to also help people to work with them better. For example, we had one with Open Knowledge Germany, also working with the open corporates data and the company registration stuff. And also one with Friedrich about the OCCRP data set. So yeah, and apart from that, for this kind of introductory work on data, we also try to think of creative ways to make people understand databases. So for example, we had a city walk through Berlin with the art collective called RYBN, which was called the Offshore Tour Operator. And they had a sort of GPS tour that people could use for the Panama Papers data set. And they could find like traces of the Panama Papers locations in the city. And also we had a workshop, for example, with the plane tracking data, which is open source data as well, to make people understand like what's actually flying in the sky above you. So we did that with Emanuel Freudenthal of Dictator Alert. So yeah, these are some of the ways that could also help people get into such databases, apart from other ways also like data visualization or mapping, of course.
Okay, thank you. Georg, do you want to speak to this issue?
Yeah, thank you. And Lieke, I think that's pretty amazing. And I think it goes exactly to my point as well, which is like, you have to reduce the complexity to ask the right questions, right? And by sort of like engaging with the data in those forums, you ask different questions that really help you understand better where to look. And I think we see this especially in procurement, that one of the key questions is that procurement data can get quite complex and detailed very quickly because it's nested, right? Because you have one procurement process, but you can have multiple contracts, or you have sort of a lot of one-to-many relationships. So the schema is in JSON, which makes it, for some more complex to then translate into a CSV. And that's one of the questions that we always get, right? Sort of like, well, I have a CSV, I just want to use a CSV, but then you lose complexity and you have to understand that to be able to do that. So it's asking the question and then turn these into specific tools, sort of like, what are the indicators that you're tracking that you want to track? For example, number of contracts to minority and women-owned businesses, or sort of questions like that, red flags for corruption, such as direct awards. And then you can build tools and dashboards that really translate that information or send you updates whenever a new contract comes up that, that matches those questions. And, Red Flags platform, for example, has really helped us focus on these key questions in the procurement process. There's some great examples. And, we've developed an easier to use template as well to input information and make it available as a data standard for civil society and journalists, sort of in a way to be able to link it up to procurement data in case you're looking for ways to sort of like manually add procurement processes, which is another way as well. But I think with procurement, we're still like a far way out, sort of like that it's actually easy to use, but I think there's a lot of good work around that by asking the right questions.
Thank you. How about Naoise?
Thanks. Lieke, I really love your example of this kind of very situated experience of walking around Berlin and kind of experiencing data that way. Really found that interesting. Well, I guess, yeah, hopefully I can kind of provide some of a kind of a user experience and a research perspective. I mean, first of all, I think like we can potentially run the risk of presenting a false dichotomy that something technical can't be accessible and user-friendly. And I think, like, importantly, if the core mandate for many investigators and researchers is really challenging power dynamics and these dominant narratives, then surely the outcomes of our projects need to be really accessible for those that are affected, as well as kind of providing as much detailed information through our research. And I think, yeah, this is, as other people have mentioned, this is really kind of like part of the challenge of good user research and interaction design, essentially kind of working out how we can represent information in a way that's clear and accessible. And I think there's kind of like several tangible, let's say, ways we can start to address this challenge. I think primarily it's really important to spend some time, as other people have mentioned, speaking to the users or potential users of your platform, again, to properly understand their motivations and the environments they work within. Because I think it's easy to forget that databases aren't these kind of like things that live in the cloud. They have a whole kind of political context that surrounds them. So even really a limited amount of user research can be really kind of beneficial to understand these types of activities that exist outside the platform. Like a quick example of this is that often journalists are very frequently using database to corroborate very specific pieces of information at the end of investigations, whereas other researchers in initial project stages are often looking to use databases in a more kind of exploratory and generative way. So again, it kind of really changes depending on the role. I think in a more practical sense, like once you have like a reasonable amount of data as well, just get a head start with the research and platform development and create things like rapid prototypes. These are really kind of like a great way to kind of like get fast into kind of like test and interaction concepts and getting really situated feedback from real users to help you kind of develop further concepts and also really kind of like understand people's mental models when using software. Because I think, again, with like complexity, this is something that's really important to consider. But I'd say in general, it's really not about weighing up technical versus user-friendly, but rather for understanding and really kind of like designing for a variety of contexts and needs.
Thank you. And let's hear from Delphine on this. Delphine?
Sorry.
There you are.
The example that I like to talk about is data share, because like the OCCRP's Aleph, data share is our platform where we share access to the various leaks that we have compiled. And we have a dedicated tech team, so they love feedback actually, but it's sometimes hard to get feedback from the users because sometimes when a user is in the database, that's not when the tech team is awake, or the tech team has, I don't know, they have a sprint going on, so they cannot necessarily respond on time because they're very busy with something they have to finish. So the tech team is very proactive in being in touch with the users. So they organize chats, user surveys, interviews, all that to make sure that they ask the right questions and they get the users to really tell them how they're using the tool and to really not feel like they're asking stupid questions. Because when you are a journalist and you have published, you're a very well-known journalist and all of a sudden you don't know how to use the tool, you can feel a bit ashamed or feel like you should know about some things because maybe you feel like you have been told in the past, but you don't really remember. And it's super important to always say that the tool is there to be used, and it's up to the user to always be able to share their experience with the tool so that it can be better, it can be useful, like we said before. A tool that's not used is really not useful for anybody. So that's what we try to do. And a good example of that is the batch search. Journalists love batch searches because if you have a long list of names, company names or whatever you need to run, having an efficient tool to run batch searches and have results is super, super useful. So this was put in place recently. So yeah.
Okay, thank you. So our next topic, what funding streams are available to keep such databases open and up to date? What are the potential hazards associated with different forms of funding in terms of precarity, independence, accessibility, or other issues? Why don't we start with Steve on this?
Sure. So yeah, as a non-profit organization, funding is obviously a huge issue. It's an issue for open ownership, and it's been an issue at other organizations that I've worked at in the past as well. I think it's common that funding is available to start a project, to build a new database, to have something kind of shiny that gets off the ground, but then keeping that going, which is where the real value comes in, is always trickier. No one wants to pay just to keep the lights on, basically. So if I think back to my experience, the projects that have survived that process of kind of getting off the ground and then trying to be maintained, they've survived because they've linked their success to the success of other projects that have a kind of a more direct impact on something that is continuously fundable and interesting to people to do. So like, basically you need to make sure that your database is a kind of a prerequisite to something else that's cool and has impact that people want to. And interestingly, that's the message that we give at Open Ownership to people in government, considering building an open ownership, a beneficial ownership register as well. You need to tie that register into the function of the government, so that when a budget cut comes along because of a pandemic or whatever, it's too valuable a service to keep running. And I think that's true of any kind of public database as well. That's how you need to look at it. I guess on the flip side, I think even as nonprofits, we shouldn't be that concerned about like charging for access to data. There's nothing inherently shameful about getting paid for the work that you're doing, even if what you're just doing is repackaging public data and making it better. But the issue there is that like charging for stuff has an overhead cost. The infrastructure of charging for things is not small, not trivial to build. I've built it a few times, and it's tough, and it's often tough to make that profitable.
Thank you. Rebecca, would you like to speak to this?
Yeah, I mean, as a result of a lot of the things that Steve has said, Open Corporates has had to be unique in its structure. So we are a commercial organisation. Over 400 companies use our data at scale. And they can access it all for free on the internet on opencorporates.com like everyone else. But if they want to access it via the API and in bulk data and build it into their processes, then there's a cost related to that. But we have a governance structure with our trust, which safeguards the Open Corporates public mission of making company information more available for the public good and safeguards our independence. And that means that we cannot be bought or sold. So this therefore precludes the usual forms of investments. There's no exit. And then on the flip side, because we're a commercial organisation, we tend not to be eligible for the majority of grant funding. I mean, we've been very fortunate to receive grants from the Moan Westlake Foundation and Illuminate, for example, but generally, because we're commercial, we fall outside of that. So we need to operate under our own commercial success with a virtuous public benefit business model. And we think this is absolutely critical because our commercial users challenge us to be at the top of our game against our well-known competitors in the business information market, and to innovate and to provide data that is essential in the business world in a way that it can be consumed at scale. This then allows us to make sure that exactly the same data and the same innovations are available freely to everyone on the web, and as structured data to public benefit individuals and organizations, journalists, for example. By doing so, that many eyes access allows for anomalies, errors and issues to be discovered faster and better, leads to better data quality and domain expertise that then supports us commercially. So for us, it's really about showing how that virtuous circle for looping together a commercial enterprise with an absolutely safeguarded public benefit mission, which can kind of deliver on both accounts, but it is a very unique structure.
Okay, thank you. I just want to salute the visiting cat we have just had, Jeremy. Jack, we'd love to hear from you on this.
I would tie this in with a comment that Georg made earlier about procurement data primarily being generated for the purpose of facilitating the bidding process. One indeed finds this out even if you're curating a data set in a fairly radical way, focused on exposing contracts with, say, tech companies and national security contractors. Actually found that some of the most common users are employees of defense contractors who email to tell me they use the tool every day within their bidding search. And then actually when I spoke with the union as well, I was surprised that their focus was also how can they use this tool for more bidding. And so I would sort of raise the concern that if there's a kind of gravitational pull away from the original purpose of the project you're created, which would be more about kind of investigating, a particular area, which might pull you into the more traditional area. And what we tend to see with a lot of contracting kind of commercial projects is they fully adopt that bidding perspective. And so I would say it's more of a concern that I have as a reasonably new nonprofit as to how to how to sort of avoid that type of funding and also keep things floating.
Thank you, Lieke. Lieke, sorry. Lieke.
Sorry.
Apology, Lieke.
No worries. Yeah, also just to say that we are, as Disruption Lab, we're not hosting certain databases, so we don't have direct experience with it, but from the people we work with, we also know what, as Steve said, that it's quite complicated to get this more long-term funding established, while it's usually possible to get something going and get some project funding or some time-restricted funding, but then at some point, obviously, it will run out. So I think it's usually very important to think about to have multiple actors involved that are interested to keep such databases running so that it's not just relying on one organization. And I think something that could be very interesting to think about is to think of ways to establish more of a community around specific databases so that there's a large group of stakeholders that are interested to keep it alive. And also perhaps, of course, then there's other options these people could help in finding funding or setting up a more stable long-term structure. And in addition to that, of course, it's very relevant to have also strong use cases to show the relevance of such a database and show why this is definitely important to keep alive, which is also why it's very important that it's connected to other people's work, like both Steve and Rebecca mentioned before.
Okay, thank you. And Jacinta.
Sure, I mean, I think as many have said, as nonprofit organizations or non-governmental organizations, it's always very hard to figure out funding. Our model of just how we've been doing this is because as hard as it is to find money to do research and data analytics, it's even harder to find money to do like people organizing, especially when you're talking about corporate accountability. There's just not a lot of one belief that people could actually change or impact these systems. And actually there's not a lot of groups that are doing this type of work. And so it's actually been very hard to argue to foundations and to different people that do grants about why this work is important, why there actually has to be organizing, going with the research and going with the exposing of some of these contracts. So for us, we work with a research company that is an LLC, that is a private company. So we receive the donations to then be able to pay them for the contracts for the research that they do for us on the campaigns. And that's been the model that we've been able to use to both be able to get funding for the research and make sure that it's also contributing to building up organizing infrastructure that can continue to sort of be able to think through how we're thinking about corporate research and corporate targeting in the social justice movement. So I would just say that that's one thing. The other thing that we've been starting to find that's actually increasingly difficult is as foundations are starting to see some of these issues as important issues to fund, they're also starting to get more funding from tech and data companies themselves. And so there's all sorts of contradictions in terms of both, like, you know, the OSF Foundation might fund certain hours of work, but then George Soros is going to go and invest in those same companies that you're targeting. So there becomes to be all of these different interests and start to see these contradictions in terms of how these funding streams go around. And I think it's a question that we're going to have to ask, both in terms of policy spaces, but also in terms of funding spaces, given the arms of tech kind of getting into every little corner of government.
Okay, thank you. We have sort of two more topic areas here to cover, but we're running a little bit behind time. So I'm just going to ask the panelists, I'm sort of going to move this along briefly so that we make sure we have time for Q&A. The next topic area is, how far can automation help the process of tagging and analyzing such resources? What are the benefits and dangers associated with automation with the data? Is it better to flag up potential data points or connections of interest immediately? Or is there a need to fully map out and fact check findings before any kind of publication? Friedrich, would you like to start?
I feel I'm getting that privilege a lot this round, but yeah, I think maybe I want to take this from the back and from the fact-checking point. I think the joke within OCCRP is that it's much easier to go through libel court before you publish a story than afterwards. So for us, it's really important that all the stuff that we put out on our site has gone through a really rigorous fact-checking process. And I think of all the stuff we do with data as kind of a lead generation process, right? It's generating hints for reporters as to where to look and then do the pavement pounding. Quite often, I'm not actually overstating it here, the data people in OCCRP are involved in investigation for the first 4 weeks, and then there's like another 6 months of people just kind of ironing out the case that we have to claim, that what we would want to claim, right? And so, yeah, that whole process I think is essential, and putting up just kind of suspicious leaks or leads seems like a dangerous business that we're moving away from further and further. In terms of what we do, a lot of it is about kind of weaving together different data sources. What I think Jack also referred to with kind of this question of like, how to identify one company as being the same as another company becomes really interesting when you think about how to identify whether the person mentioned in this data set, and let's say the Panama Papers, is actually the politician from my country. And also to find out, for example, hey, I have 20,000 documents here. Tell me all the ones that have an oligarch mentioned in them. Or tell me all the ones that have this list of really suspicious companies mentioned in them, which is kind of what we're trying to do research towards, this notion of kind of record linkage between different types of source information. I also want to give a heads up. There's a really interesting set of work, I think, being started by a guy called Jonathan Stray, who has been doing investigative tech for a long time and is now getting into form extraction. So how to take like a bunch of scanned government disclosure forms, for example, and turn the material from that into structured data that could be analyzed, which is often a real bottleneck in the work we do. And then obviously, like, the thing that we really need is for the people who are pure reporters in OCCRP to hate us and to mistrust us, right? And then to turn this whole thing into a kind of confrontational process where they then challenge, like, why are you saying that this is probably the same politician as this? Or why are you saying this? And then having this kind of internal distrust almost of saying, yeah, okay, here's like the lead from data. How does this pan out in the reporting, in the evidence?
Steve, would you like to briefly weigh in on this?
Sure, I don't have tons to add, and I know Friedrich is much more of an expert on this because we don't do our own investigations. We're just a tool. We provide data for people to use. We do in some parts of that tool, we do automate some kind of processing of data. And to the point I really wanted to add on that was just that we try to be really transparent about what we've done to the data to make sure that that is clear to everybody, so that it's not a black box of magic that if you don't trust us, you can figure out what we did and whether you trust that or not. And I think that's the key point to make for tool builders in that sense, basically.
Thank you. Jeremy, would you want to weigh in on this briefly?
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. I think that from the perspective of tools that are open to anybody on the web, the idea of mixing things together that we have different levels of certainty about is an absolute nightmare. That if there's one set of data on the page that is exactly as you received it from, the government registry of corporations or whatever, and then another piece of data that's based on a machine learning model that's 95% accurate, if that's not distinguished really clearly, it's a nightmare, because 95% certainty might well mean you're wrong in something that you're taking to publication. However, the flip side of that, for tools that are built for expert users, it presents a really awesome opportunity for us to experiment with new ways of automation for our investigations, because expert researchers, expert investigators are really good at holding pieces of information in their head at different levels of certainty. That we can present them with results of, I think most of these things are probably correct. Treat it like a lead, as Friedrich said. And I think that's a really great opportunity, like what we did with the Luanda leaks, of using AI to search for similar documents. The fact, so to speak, that document A is similar to document B isn't something that would ever get surfaced in a news story. The reporter or investigator still has to judge the documents sort of on their own. But the automation helps them find the things that they were looking for, which turned out to be, I think, really powerful.
Thank you. And Jack, lastly on this question.
So I couldn't agree more with being very explicit about the lead as opposed to conclusion framing. So in fact, my work on starting to curate databases was actually a result of me having professionally built recommendation systems at Google. And I realized, well, if I can do this for videos based upon, patterns of browsing, then why can't I, for example, use government contracts to say who are the companies like Palantir or like Anduril or Cellebrite, et cetera. And it turns out you can get pretty good answers from this, but it's dangerous to imply that as a conclusion of any sort of ESG framing, that if you're like a questionable company, that you're also questionable. But at the same time, it is a good lead. But interestingly, what I found is, even though that's a fairly high tech thing to do as far as curation goes, it's actually not even really the thing that I tend to want to use. Most of the time, just simple search is by far the most useful tool. And so I think, really there's no substitute for a lot of curation and constantly providing links to things. So,
Okay. And thank you all so much for what has been a terrific discussion. Because we're a little short on time, I'm actually going to move right into Q&A, because we've got some great questions coming in. So let me let's tackle a few of those. We have an interesting one here. To all, have you been working on any COVID-19 investigation? What kind of difficulties do or could you see in implementing an accurate database if we look at the scale of the event? Anybody want to take that on? If I've certainly been doing a lot of. Go ahead, Rebecca. Yeah.
I can talk to a little bit of that. So we recently published a case study because the Anti-Corruption Data Collective undertook an investigation on the US Paycheck Protection Program. So this was in the US, specifically, but the SBA provided a publicly available data set of 600,000 businesses that received loans more than $150,000. So very specific to the companies who were requesting and received loans. But it was a really neat case study of how they interact with our API. So I've published the link on our on the Q&A chat. I think the scale is on COVID investigations is this, it's so wide, right? There's specific government support for companies, but to be able to really understand that and analyze that, you need open data around who has benefited from that, and that's not available across all jurisdictions. I can't talk to outside of the company data, so I'll let someone else take that on from there.
Would anyone else on the panel like to speak to the COVID-19 question? No. Okay. Let's move on to another question, which is, what are the issues with storing data about powerful people in a database? Are there issues of compliance with data protection laws like the GDPR? Who would like to tackle that? Yeah, Delphine.
Yeah, we do have some issues sometimes with the offshore leaks data that we have published. So we have a website called offshoreleaks.icij.org, which is freely accessible, available to everybody. You can also download data in bulk, and we have various sources for this data. There is data that comes from Panama Papers, Paradise Papers, but there's also data that comes from corporate registries, which at the times were leaked to us. So some of the people who are named in the offshore leaks database do not necessarily agree with their names being online and their addresses being online. So we do sometimes receive complaints, or if it's not complaints, at least requests for this information to be removed. But so far, we have always been able to prove that this doesn't fall under the GDPR requirements, as it's published for a journalistic purpose. This is the main argument we have used so far. But as we know, the law is always moving forward, so we never know what kind of challenges we will face in the future. But so far, the data is still online and available to all.
Thank you, Delphine. Let's get in another question here. Has anyone looked at postal fraud or voter fraud issues? And is any voter data made available for analysis? Anybody like to tackle that? Jeremy?
Sure. Yes. In the United States, a lot of voter data is public. In some cases, like in North Carolina, you can just go to the Secretary of State's website and download a list of all the registered voters and whether they voted in a particular election. You also get some demographic data like race, gender, age. You may even get telephone number, which makes it a great resource. In other states, you might have to pay a couple $100s to get that data. You may have to promise not to use it for commercial purposes, that sort of thing. The thing that is secret, of course, is how somebody voted. You don't have any idea who they voted for. But you absolutely can get that data. The thing to be careful of is that it's tricky. And so it's worthwhile to chat with experts before you run with your conclusions. We've seen instances lately of people being like, oh my gosh, there are all these people who were born in 1900. That's implausible. And it is implausible. It turns out that's not voter fraud. It turns out they didn't write down the person's birth date. And so they just put in 1900. And it turns out to not be very interesting. But you want to be careful so you don't make embarrassing mistakes.
Okay. That's terrific. Here is a question that's probably for Friedrich, I guess, which is, how much does the aleph-occrp.org project cost per year?
I don't know to what extent that is public. It's actually a real concern that, we're basically trying to we're trying to build a memory to investigative journalism, right? Because there's this real thing that there's a leak that came out like 4 weeks ago, and everybody's eating it this week, but then next week nobody's going to be looking at it anymore because there's a newer and shinier thing that's come out. The problem with that model, obviously, is that you keep on collecting more and more and more stuff, and the more stuff we collect, the more expensive it gets. And we also have a problem with commercializing this, because the very people who would most likely end up wanting to pay for something like Aleph are the people that end up in our investigations in concerning frequency. So we don't want to take that exact money.
I have a question for the panelists, which actually came up in my reporting recently, which is a source who was busy deleting all of their interactions they'd had with me online through Gmail, through WhatsApp, and had a question about whether if he were subpoenaed, would that linger as metadata, and how would his employer obtain that information? What does one say to an anxious source about metadata, if anybody would like to touch on that? Anybody have any takers for? Oh yeah,
I mean,
thank you.
But maybe it will be a very generalistic answer, so I hope it's not too general. But I think that many sources are becoming more and more nervous about this, also because the technology is seemingly becoming more complicated. But I think if there is a way for people to switch from using GAFA provided technology such as Google and others to more secure platforms, it's always the best thing to do. And those platforms do exist, and they are sponsored and supported by a network of people who believe in source protection and freedom. So I do think that anytime this happens, the person should be informed about this kind of tools as fast as possible, so that the relationship with the source is as much protected as possible. Because once it's on the internet, it's extremely difficult to remove. So switch to Signal, switch to whatever other platform is much more secure.
Okay, thank you so much. Would we have a little bit more time, and we're waiting for a few more questions to come in. Why don't we just go back to, let's take a look at what are the prospects for meaningful enforcement of the EU anti-money laundering directives and beneficial ownership registries? And will this have a significant impact on preventing illicit finance flows? If anybody would want to speak to that.
This sounds like my wheelhouse, so
Okay.
I can jump in. So at Open Ownership, we mainly work directly with lower income countries, so not EU countries specifically. But obviously we do monitor the situation around the world as much as we can, and try to keep tabs on the progress that's being made on beneficial ownership everywhere. Generally speaking, in the EU, it's a bit of a disappointing story, I think would be fair to say. We see lots of countries restricting access to their data through some kind of arcane technical or procedural requirements, or if not doing that, then charging access to data. And generally, a few shining examples aside, not giving particularly useful access, and not giving the bulk data access that Rebecca was talking about earlier, but letting you go through a really kind of restrictive form where you can put in individual names and search for things on a kind of one-by-one basis. A lot of countries were late in even delivering that limited amount of functionality, and a few are still kind of lagging behind, which they've obviously missed the deadline significantly. So in terms of the enforcement, it's obviously not super strong. But saying that, we do on the whole see like registers are being built, this data is being collected. The main issue is just that like we don't see enough access, particularly for civil society. The kind of investigations that were mentioned earlier with the UK's register, which really helped improve the quality of it. That kind of investigation is impossible in most of the EU at the moment, because the governments aren't making access to that data available. But I think from our perspective as well, the argument we also make is it's not just about detecting illicit activity, but all of these countries are leaving a kind of a huge amount of value on the table for their economy. Like this data is worth much more than the €1 or €2 per record that they're getting from it when they charge for access. it's worth a lot to society and their economy as a whole if they released it en masse, basically.
Thank you. What I would love to do is, because we're almost out of time, I would just like everybody to weigh in with a word on the question of what you are currently limited by in your work. Labor, disk space, technical expertise for analysis, or something else. Let's just go in order and very brief answers. Jack.
All of the above, but I would say curation is in funding are the biggest bottlenecks.
Okay, Delphine.
Sorry, can you repeat?
Yeah, what are you currently limited by? Labor, disk space?
Yes, I would say funding, definitely.
Funding. Okay, Steve, what are you limited by?
For open ownership, I think it would be political will to implement the reforms that we're asking for.
Friedrich, what are you limited by?
I mean, funding creates the other ones, but I'd also go for it's COVID and nobody's met a person with a hard drive in a while. So journalism.
Yeah. Yes. Jeremy, what are you limited by?
Time.
Time. Georg.
I think in interconnected data.
Okay, Lieke.
Yeah, I was also going to say time, because there's a lot of possible connections and things that happened as a result of the meetups and workshops and people that got in touch. And we would love to have more time to follow up with people and work more on some of the things that came out of that.
Okay, Rebecca.
I can't decide between funding and time.
Nisha.
I think three things really: funding, legal advice and guidance, and then actual human resources for data review and validation. So quite a lot of stuff.
Okay, and Jacinta, what are you limited by?
Well, I'm just going to say policing, because if ICE agents wouldn't be bothering us so much, I would have more time and resources and things to do other stuff.
Very, very interesting. I want to thank, first of all of the terrific panelists who gave of their time, which is in short supply, obviously, for this really interesting discussion. Tom, thank you for inviting me to moderate this discussion, and to all of the participants, thank you for joining us. There have been wonderful resources in the chat, which have lots of information and interesting links, and we hope you will continue to interact with the panelists and whatnot. But for that, I just want to bring this meeting to a close and thank you all for attending. So thank you very much.
It's been great, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.